We are on this show, and let us get our light bulb going. And welcome to Evolutionar, the last one of July, because I'm going off on for a family reunion, so we'll be away for a couple of weeks and not back until August, at which point I'll try to figure out whether or not I can even get on, because they're not doing Google Hangouts starting in August. So it's all up in the air. We're not knowing what the hell we're doing. Tortuganwordpress.com is my website, where there's a whole bunch of stuff there. And if you haven't been downloading all that material, well, you could start. So let's get back over to the world. Ah, Brian, hello. We were just talking about you and quite a few other people as well. I've been floating around the concept with Karis, who's going to be here, of eventually, maybe with this need to switch to a new format, maybe we want to switch to a thing where I've got like partners who can help, and we can do consolidated shows, and somebody can kind of moderate and handle the grunt work of organizing the thing each week, and it works on the platform they're familiar with. And
I don't know. I've never moderated anything, you know.
But it's just a matter of having like a discussion and bringing up topics. And I think that the two topic issue seems to work pretty good, of where there's kind of a main continuing theme, which in this case has been the perpetual contested bones matter. And then whatever kind of pops up as hot button issues that I've been acquiring information on over the weeks, that I then plug in as the second topic, with minds of having always links so everybody can follow up on it. So it's like kind of a clearinghouse of stuff. Lisa for Truth, it was just working on a show about the evolution of the brain. Oh, Korag says, man, you and Jackson against Nephilim was epic. Thank you.
Oh, you know, I haven't seen that one. I should.
Yeah, it was a reluctant one for Jackson, and in some ways for me, because Nephilim is an annoying presuppositional person who drives everybody up the wall. That he says he's not a presuppositionalist, but of course he's a presuppositionalist. You know, he can call himself an evidentialist all he likes. And if he's got a way to run the show, fine. But if he's just in a structured debate context where he has to shut up after a while and other people get a chance to talk, then I think it's possible to deal with him.
Is he a Gish Gallagher?
Oh boy, he is a Gish sprinter. He is a marathonist. But he has a very limited number of issues he deals with. And what we were trying to do, Jackson and I, was to drag him to apply his non-existent model to something. So he would be talking about genetic decay or anything like that. Well, okay, apply it to something. Did Adam and Eve have ALUs? Any of these kinds of specific topics. He can't apply it to anything, in part because the creationists haven't applied it to anything. And since he is basically a secondary copyist who doesn't even tell you what his sources are, if you ask the right questions, he's sunk. SFT, standing for truth at least, is such a detail fiddler and memorizer that he can bounce back onto the tropes fairly easily. But Neff isn't at that level. So he just kind of powers away at abstractions that never quite get anywhere. Skeptic Reviews, hello and chat. Yeah. Lisa for Truth said they're all presuppositionalists. Yeah, it's very difficult to get out of that. For anybody who hasn't heard the word presuppositional before, what cave have you been living in? But it's a matter of things that you're assuming to be true. It would be like axioms in mathematics if you come from that background. But in mathematics, axioms are things that must be assumed to be true, otherwise you have no game.
Like parallel lines never intersect.
Although that too is in fact one of the delicious things is that the parallel postulate is only a postulate. Okay. It's not a necessary axiom. And one of the things that went back to, it's been centuries ago, when non-Euclidean geometry was worked out, where they go, you could make a perfectly fine mathematics that doesn't have that. And it turns out that curved space is non-Euclidean, that parallel lines can meet or diverge depending upon the curvature of the space. And the real universe runs that way. And
well,
it depends
I'm going
on what
to
scale
try
you're
to extract my foot from my mouth now. for the
Well,
second show in a row.
it's not at all a foot and mouth thing, because this is not the sort of stuff that gets into really common discussion. I only knew about these things because I ran into higher level calculus in college. I was for a while a math major, history major dual, and my brain started frying at higher matrices, and I realized, no, I didn't have temperament for that. But the point is, I learned an awful lot along the way about what goes on in deeper mathematics. And if there's anything you want to cure your sense of, well, common sense says, oh, shit, no, mathematics, where you discover that so many things are very different. There's a bunch of books that have been written by a variety of people on transfinite numbers and pi and e, and which is the basis of natural logarithms. E to the pi power plus 1 equals 0 is one of the famous thing, Euler's formula. So you learn about all these wacky mathematicians, most of whom, by the way, tended to be theists. Euler was very religious. So was Gödel, who came out with the undecidability proposition. There was kind of a fist fight between the groups, which could be thought of as presuppositionalist mathematics, that back in the 19-teens and 20s, people like Bertrand Russell, who is an icon of atheism, was under the notion that you could eventually develop a super perfect mathematics that would describe everything from the original postulates all the way through to everything, and there would be no problems. It could all be done rigorously. And Gödel comes in and dynamites it with the undecidability issue, where he's literally saying, not just in group theory, but in all logical systems that contain rigorous systems, they're going to have undecidable propositions. You can't get away from it.
You're going to give your audience whiplash when you actually get to the topic.
Oh, yeah. Well, there is a topic. Yes, indeed. So, but this was a sidelight on that. Yeah, we should have a wonderful thing on mathematics, but it is a thing that completely blows to smithereens your notions of common sense and what normal reality is. It's no coincidence that advanced physics makes use of very sophisticated mathematics, because the real universe at the subatomic level or at the big space level and Big Bang and all that is weird, and you just can't use common sense on it. Anyway, back to contested bones and radiometric dating. They finally finished their stupid Australopithecines and human beings are alive together chapter, where they were just shuffleboarding around the same misrepresentations to imply that people were existing with Australopithecines. And now they're on to the dating game. Finally, up rears the creationist head, because the only way they're going to start quibbling about the dating of things is if they are young Earth creationists, because that's the only group that pays attention to this stuff. So it was a dead giveaway. And lo and behold, we finally start getting some more creationist sources, Andrew Snelling and Steve Austin and all of that little bang. And I put up just a few direct links to some criticism, which, needless to say, so far, there's not a slightest shred of indication that Rupi ever bothers to listen to critics of the creationist position. All he's doing when he's talking about the problems of radiometric dating is quoting the stuff that's siphoned from the creationists, even down to the technical papers. As I've been going through the source base, they've got some stuff from Dalrymple, who's one of the major, still active in the field. And there was an old paper that he did with Moore back in 1968 on excess argon-40 in volcanoes. And this is one that's been criticized or quote mined from creationists for quite some time. So when I'm looking up these sources, I'm discovering, oh, this is already in my reference bibliography. Why? Because it's already been used by creationists. And what they do is they say, okay, radiometric dating has to be completely wrong, because when they date current lava flows with the argon, potassium argon dating system, it seems as though it's millions of years old. Well, why? Because the argon isn't escaping under certain contexts, especially pillow lava underwater, that those things are keeping. Normally, argon is just leaking away. So the only argon that's left in a deposit would be stuff that's generated by the decay chain, rather than the material that's accumulated. And so if you get a perfectly fine dating system, unless argon is leaked into or out of the system, or you've got stuff that's formed from magma that already has a different balance to it that then gets recycled in other magma. So argon has always been a quirky area. Anyway, there's one paper, if it had been open access, I would have put a link up to it, from Science, Volume 161, 1968, is that the scientists had been very careful in analyzing how much argon was leaking out underwater or not, and why this was so, and that as they were going from low depth to greater depth, the amount of argon was shifting. So they were physically measuring the process of why this was a factor and how they were compensating for it. None of that has been mentioned by Rupi and Sanford. Why? Because I'm imagining that the secondary sources they nicked that paper from didn't discuss that either. So you get, I put up a posting from No Answers in Genesis, which is an old, long-standing one that obviously criticizes Answers in Genesis stuff. And then there's a Talk Origins posting that I put up as well that goes into one of Henry Morris's gaffes, that it's basically the same trope over and over again, which is you've got radiometric systems that you have to pay attention to the geological context in which the variables can vary more. And when you pay attention to that, you can make perfectly validating things. The difficulty is that there is a whole discipline involving isochron datings that is a way of calibrating that is self-correcting and immediately identifies if the rock has undergone weird metamorphosis.
Define isochron for the audience, please.
Oh, it's isochron, isochron. I will type it into the live feed here as well. It's a handy little word. It's like Lagerstätten. It's one of those terms that if you know this and remember this in your head and look to see whether they bring it up or not. An isochron is two different radiometric systems that, if they're been running without any variation or leakage, are going to come up with the same date, right? And so what it turns out is that if that condition has been met, you form a straight line called an isochron. And the angle of the line indicates how old it is. And I think, and the height of the line, well, the height of the line indicates part of the age, and the steepness of it. There's a whole bunch of variables that you can deal with as to what it tells. And if there has been metamorphosis, if stuff has gotten leaked in or out in either one of the things, then it won't form an isochron. It'll form dots all over the place. So it's a self-calibrating system, and it doesn't depend on the initial conditions. It's just delicious. And boy, creationists don't like talking about isochrons. A few of them try to maneuver around them. Steve Austin is one of those, and Andrew Snelling, but very few go that far because they got to play tricky games. And in fact, if you look up some of the criticism of Steve Austin over the years about, and I think one of the postings that Answers in Genesis one goes into some of the fast and loose games that were going on. Another bit about these dating of recent lava flows is, what if you were asked to take a yardstick and measure a human hair? You got the wrong tool. So they're trying.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah, there you go. If you use a yardstick to measure the width of your hair.
Oh, width of your hair. You said,
yeah, not the length, the width. Yeah, it's that that any even microscopic amounts of argon in something that is measuring a really old thing normally, tiny amounts of argon will be enough to give a false reading of millions of years because of the slow rate of the decay. So you're trying to use a yardstick to measure something very, very recent. So in principle, it's a cheat. And the creationists never mentioned that they're doing a shell game. It's more 3-card Monty.
Are there ways to know if they are aware that they're doing a shell game?
Ooh, yeah. When you start looking at the source data, that there are quite a few people who are so studying what Snelling has been doing over the years in Austin, is that if they don't know what they're doing in the shell game, they're way more talented than you would think. That the details that they parse around, Jackson Wheat and I are going into this, and we had a wonderful background reading of our radiometric dating chapter and the geology stuff for the new book to confirm that we are on the right mark on this stuff. That some of the tiptoes that Snelling does around the data field, why he avoids certain kind of rock types, that he's very careful about how he describes stuff, is so tactically precise that you gotta think they're doing it deliberately, because like your Kurt Wise example you were telling me about, it's somebody that he doesn't really want to say a falsehood, so he's got to phrase it so that he can sustain the thing that he wants to be true and must be true no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it turns out Karras ceased to be a creationist in part because of the attitude of Kurt Wise, who is a still active, amiable old chap, creationist, young Earth creationist, who has an actual paleontology degree, studied under Stephen Jay Gould, which must have been fun for them both, and he's still very, very busy in the field. He is one of those honest creationists, as Richard Dawkins says, people who know the data supports the actual science, but they don't want it to be true because they have a dogma that mandates it. And that Wise is always going to try to find ways around stuff. He's well aware that there are transitional forms in the fossil record, but he wants to pretend that they're not. So I've seen him literally in his written texts where he'll mention a whole string of transitional forms, and then when he gets around to trying to dismiss transitional forms, he's started to remove them, so he doesn't mention them in his summary. And it's such
that sort of thing really I find very disconcerting. Like I was telling RJ earlier, the attitude that had deconverted me was that which said, if there is enough evidence to prove that the Bible is false in an area, let's say, for the sake of this conversation, geology, then he would reject that body of evidence and turn instead to the Bible and say that that is true just out of necessity to his faith.
yeah.
And for me, that is so much of a disrespect to truth. I'd grown up. Hold on.
Yeah. Always is the data. In the beginning are the data. The data always are. The data must be accounted for. One of the things that is so clear in the history of scientific investigation is how little the data changes. Once in a while, you have an example of a fraudulent data field. Piltdown Man is a classic example of a made-up fake that is a false piece of data. But when you look at the data that an Isaac Newton or Galileo would have been looking at, or the early geologists like Sedgwick, or a contemporary astronomer would be looking at, it's not that there's different data, it's that there's more data. And so things that might have appeared in a particular model that turns out we have a different perspective on, it's not because the data changed. When you look at plate tectonics and continental drift, I'm old enough to remember, and you probably have grown up.
I'm sorry.
You have grown up in a world where continents moving has just been part of the world view frame, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not with me. When I was growing up, when I wanted to read books on geology that were done in the 50s and 60s, continental drift was something wacky that Wegener came up with. It was a very questionable notion.
In the world that I grew up in, continental drift was something that occurred as a result of the waters in the flood.
Yeah, I love that one. The super lickety split continent movements. The problem is, and this is what's fun, that Jackson Wheat and I are going into that in the new Rocks book, is that they can't make up their mind what the continents were. That it's a shell game. Some creationists actually think that the Rodinia supercontinent, which is Precambrian, was the pre-flood world, and then after the flood came along, then super lickety fast the continents reposition into Pangaea temporarily, and then into the modern world arrangement that we have. And anybody that's familiar with how land masses move and all that is going that just ain't cutting it. And then there are others who try to argue that Pangaea is the pre-flood world. And ironically, Kurt Wise was just trampling into this area in this stupid video. He had done a lecture that was done in 2017. And two creationists in the course of just the last few weeks have been throwing that same video at me independently, just yesterday for one of them. And so when I clicked on it and looked at it, I go, oh, that's the Kurt Wise video. I'm analyzing that. In fact, I hope to be doing some discussion of it. That Wise was presenting what was, in effect, a summary of a cartoon. And all of the young Earth creationist models is just cartoon. It doesn't ever get to the level of exact detail. Oh, well, Lisa Patricius wasn't Valbara first in supercontinents. The ones that I'm aware of, Pangaea is the only supercontinent that occurred with life on its surface. All the supercontinents, which run about 600 million year cycle, by the way. So it looks like that things are kind of bouncing together and then they pull apart and shift and then come back together again. But they're doing it in different locations. So the Pangaea supercontinent was basically north to south, pole to pole. And then there was a Panthalassa supersea that was basically everything else. There were probably little smirky little landmasses, islands and stuff like that over hot spots, but most of the landmass was bulked together. Jump back another 500 million years to Rodinia, and it was more clustered in the southern hemisphere. There may have been some land masses in the north, but most of that wasn't the case. So it was down in the south. Well, we know that you've got a world ocean pretty much in one hemisphere, and that is a big differential in terms of how ocean currents would be working between the northern and southern winters, and the position of the Earth cycling through the Milankovitch cycles. That's going to function differently in that kind of a context than it would when the landmass goes north to south, pole to pole. But it wasn't affecting life on the land because there was no life on the land. Back when Rodinia was going on, you had little Ediacara palm fronds and Dickinsonia and stuff underwater, and the first early metazoans, but nothing up on land. There may have been some bacteria, but it was dead as a doornail otherwise. Looked like Antarctica on a busy day.
Hey, RJ.
And then, yeah.
Our topic today is hominids.
Oh, is it really?
That's what you told me.
No, it was radiometric dating and relation too. But anyway, it was relating to the question on there. But prior to that, then there was a Columbia supercontinent. That would be way back 1.2 billion years, something like that. And the problem is trying to piece together the jigsaw puzzle. There's not many really, really, really old rocks to play with. So trying to piece together these prior land masses becomes more and more speculative the farther back you go. So that's the end of that little soapbox. Anyway.
You told me it was hominids.
Oh, that was the last of the hominids. Yes, because this was switching over to their new radiometric dating chapter. So they actually get back to it because they're trying to argue. There's the famous KBS Tough issue, which was a radiometric dating issue about how old a particular volcanic ash was, because it depended on that you weren't dating the bones, you were dating the volcanic ash above and below it. The moment anybody says airborne volcanic ash, my little radar goes off, because that can't be flood time now, can it? So what's fascinating is that Rupi and Samford are making no effort to even mention the flood, let alone when was this stuff happening? When were Australopithecines and these tools being made? Was this after the flood? When? What year was it? Can we peg that down? Was that before or after the Egyptians were building the pyramids? Can we get a chronology going here? We don't get chronology because they only talk about anti-chronology, complaining about radiometric dating, complaining that the dates are off. And so we don't have to worry about the dates. Excuse me, you've got a chronology implicit in your argument. If you are too cowardly to present it, you are not playing the scholarly game.
One thing that I find rather amusing is that they'll give you the margin for error of some of these dating methods, and then they'll leap from that to, well, the Earth is therefore actually 6,000 to 10,000 years old. That does not even know.
Yeah, and in fact, that's one of the things you can do to tell how reliable the scientists think a particular dating is by how big the margins are. By the way, in typical science literature, one of the things is that what you're seeing in a radiometric dating with a plus or minus on the end, the plus or minus is a sigma value. which is a statistical value. And typically what they're saying is that the date is likely to fall within like 30% of that. And that and 2 sigmas, it's likely to be like 60% and more. So that means that you would have to actually double that number to give a broader range. Well, if you've got a dating of 1.6 billion years with a sigma value of 100 million years, then that could be a 200 million year range from that to make you reasonably confident of it. But if you're talking about 1.6 billion years ago versus 1.8 billion versus 1.4,
therefore the
it's
Earth is
not that big of a
6,000 years
deal.
old.
Yeah. If you're dealing with radiometric dating that's much more recent, like radiocarbon dating, where you get a date of 50,000 plus or minus 8 or 3, now you've got a 50,000 plus or minus 6 on either direction for sigma values. That can actually make quite a bit of difference if you're trying to figure out what populations we're doing in early Homo sapiens, and that can make a difference, because you're using your yardstick to measure something that is pretty big. And so now that margin for error plays a different role. So you have to remember what the circumstances are. Lisa for Truth, is that like standard deviation? Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Sigma value, standard deviation. I was just using the technical term on that. And so typically it's 2 standard deviations. You get a higher level of probability. That is, if I remember, and if I remembered it incorrectly, like I think I last studied this in college before Karis was born. So if I've gotten the thing wrong, that I can be on it. But I think the value is like 30% for 1 sigma and 60% for 2 sigma, and then 90% for 3 sigma.
Oh, I
And
think
so
they
depending
hear
on,
the term margin of error, and all they hear is the word error,
yeah.
and they forget margin.
Yeah, and the point is that I don't care if you've got the problems with radiometric dating. Present what your argument is. So put your thing to the test. If there could be all the error in the world with radiometric dating, but if your alternative is ancient astronauts or magic unicorns, and you have no evidence for it, your alternative doesn't become more plausible because of the problems with radiometric dating. And that's something that you always have to remember, is that part of that source methods thing is to present what your model is.
Also, how many
You
types
need
of
to.
dating methods are there? I think Stephen Bauman was telling me earlier there are 12 or something like that. Maybe.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, I know there's one involving thorium and strontium and potassium and argon and uranium, thorium and all that. And they have different rates and they have different foibles
Some
depending
of
on
them you even use
circumstances.
light for.
And they're usually used in conjunction for isochron dating, because isochrons eliminate that worry about the metamorphic factors that can alter the things. And then they also pay attention to the little details, because you just can't do it in a vacuum. You have to look at what like crystal forms are. There are certain kind of crystallization processes that only take place in certain temperature ranges. They only take place in certain pressure ranges. They only take place in certain time ranges.
And some of
And
them
so that
hold the like they record the magnetic field at the time of their creation, so it's pretty.
Oh yeah, anything once it cools below melting point, it basically freezes. If there are particles that
Curie
relate
point,
to
right?
magnetism, it freezes them in whatever relationship they were. So that's how you can look at paleomagnetism.
Isn't that because
That's
they
how they,
reached their Curie point and they've lost
yeah,
all record of
bingo.
right.
Curie point, name for Madame Curie and our happy little Curie gang. Yeah. And so all of these things, all of these clues are brought in. Another shell game you can always be looking for, Karis, is when they don't, if they don't give you sources, or if they do give you sources, they don't tell you much about the contexts. And if they are aware of criticism, or if they aren't aware of criticism, why not? Shouldn't they mention that? And the more you don't get that, the more you just are harping on things for apologetic purposes, you're in Kurt Wise mode and buckle your seatbelt.
One point, though, the Curie point was not named after Madame Curie, but after Pierre Curie.
Oh, Pierre, the husband. Yeah. And their daughter was a wonderful scientist too. And I think all of them had problems with radiation sickness from all of the damn radionucleotides they worked out with. Andy Lord brings up, we got some wonderful things here with Puffalophagus. Speaking of underwater volcanic hotspots and continental drift, how to creationists explain the string of underwater seamounts that connect Asia, Russian Peninsula to Hawaii. Oh, yeah, they don't. that in fact that island chain has been going on a long time, and the plates have shifted slightly during that process. So there's a kink to show as the plates had shifted long time ago, and they can go all the way up to, I think, the Kuril Islands or somewhere up in Kamchatka. It goes way past. There's a whole island, dead island chains, and new islands, of course, are forming out in the hot part of the hot spot. And eventually that's going to shift to where the current big island of Hawaii will have eroded away, and a newer island will have formed farther down on the hot spot. It's been a very nice old one. Then we got Andy Lord says accelerated decay was the only one I've seen that they actually tried. The rate project, we all know how that one turned out. Yeah, the creationists still play with that. Snelling, Woodmarap, still dangle accelerated decay, and we have a section on it in the new Rocks Are There book. What they were saying is that, well, you could have the isotopes there, but if the decay rate changed, was accelerated at some point, then that would produce all of these little nucleotides faster. Isn't that simple? How do you speed up radioactive decay? And it turns out that tain't easy. You just don't say, okay, we'll turn the stove up a little higher on the rock, and that will speed up the decay rate. Nah, won't have any effect on it. You can, in supernova, produce some things that there are some isotopes that will speed up their decay quite significantly in a supernova. Millions of degrees hotter than the sun.
My.
I think that would be uncomfortable for Noah or Adam. Little too toasty. Hey, get out the marshmallows, kids. It's 8 million degrees Kelvin.
Well, they would
And as
probably
all of their
invoke
matter
miracles.
turns into plasma.
They'd probably invoke miracles by that point, but I mean,
that would be easier. Why don't they just do that? That's what's so
know.
funny. But there is a long-standing tradition of the craving for scientific credibility, and you find this in the hunt for Exodus miracles that are scientific-y, that makes sense. All the creationists are trying to account for this with physical processes, with the flood, that they actually don't do a damn miracle. It's like the wall of fire in Cecil B. DeMille Exodus. Why can't you just have a damn miracle?
Well, also, the more they insist upon, these miracles aligning with science, the more they're eliminating their miracle. It's not a miracle if it is, scientifically possible.
Exactly. Yeah. This is one of the traditional problems with that approach, is that if you can explain it with a physical process, why need the miracle to begin with? Why call it a miracle? Why not just call it a physical process? And that's why attempts to connect up the Exodus with the ash fall and effects of the Santorini eruption fall into that same problem, plus the fact that the chronology is wrong, that nobody can figure out how the hell the Exodus could be occurring back in the 17th century BC. That is way too early for that. And it was even bad when they thought it was at 1500, but no, it's like 1675, something like that.
And also, the more they insist on science, the less faith they are able to have. I mean, you can't have faith where knowledge is.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they're taking away their own reward in heaven. So I don't understand.
Yeah, well then, and that way at least they can be in Kurt Wise territory. I'm a little past the half hour, so let me do my shameless plug.
Okay.
And get off to that. So there's RJ hunts for the share button again. There we go. He goes through this every single time. It's pretty lame. That's the way it goes. There's our patrons. RJ's patrons at patreon.com. There's a link in the video description. So anybody who has a buck or two burning a hole in their pocket that decides that what I'm doing here is worthwhile, and you aren't already on our wonderful list of people, consider joining at any level. It is all mucho appreciated. Our colleagues, Hendril and Puffaluffagus, who's in the Blythe Fade, Eric and Suris, the researchers, Travis and Convert Me, and Eat Meal and Brad and Ralph and Palogia, and Ugly German Truths and Sur, and assistant researchers, Mike and Duranko and James and Nana and Benjamin Simpson and Totas Real, friends, Daniel, Stephen Bauman, Steve, Marigay Meadows, Insects Are Cool, Morton Nielsen, Bo, Staggles, Alex, and Paul, and legacy patrons. They were able to help for a while, and I still thank you for the fact that you helped at any point. Jan and Jody and John and Keith and Andrew and Dio and Yui and Mona and Daniel and Son, Everett, Zeshi. I know Andrew, for example, had to cease to be a patron because he had some financial circumstances, and I will understand that from my angle as well. So I still say you helped out at some point. You still get a thank you. And then going through my rigmarole down to the next stage, the WordPress.com, there's all that. There's 1,000 pages or so roughly of material. There's the 3 Mac Revolutionary episodes. You can find that on Academia EDU. I posted it up there too. All of that material, it's in old written format with footnotes. So it's not as comfy to use as the newer book that is done without that format. But nonetheless, the information is there. And I did a lot of material on human evolution and radiometric dating and flood geology and creationist bad methods and the reptile-mammal transition and birds and biblical exegesis and Atlantis and the interconnection that creationists have with cryptozoology. There's a lot of stuff knocking around in there. Anyway, patreon.com downer tip, and there's also gofundme.com DCGo. You can put recurring things there as well, or single gifts to the project, and everything is very much appreciated here. I'm at least squeaking along better than I was last year, to where I only have to occasionally worry about whether I'm going to get ink as opposed to food. I can actually be fairly confident about being able to do both at the same time most of the time. And yeah, I do the food over the ink anyway. So there's the shameless plug thing. There's a prospect Karis brought up that maybe a more sophisticated little channel plug might be done in future on that. I'm perfectly open to that kind of stuff. And yeah, that's, remember, I am an old fart who, when I was growing up, I was not thinking that in the 21st century, I was going to be sitting in front of my home computer that did not yet even imagine exist, that I would be having my microphone that Cirrus and company helped organize for me, and that I would be doing weekly video casts that would be potentially visible by everyone on the planet, although at about 100 or 200 views per episode, we're still pretty far on the market penetration front. I envy Pelagia, or for that matter, look at the number of people that watch flat earth videos or creationist twaddle videos. They get like, there's crap. Kurt Wise will get 5,000 views on that thing. So I have a long way to go in terms of that. And the only way to have that is for everybody that watches the show to tell people about it and to connect up things, to say that maybe I've got some stuff on here that they haven't heard before in a fresh way. In particular, the source methods approach, which is a really important thing to deal with. Karis is going to be interviewing me for her own show after this. We're going to do some recordings on that, but I can give a little preface of it, is that source methods is not something that's magic. Exactly to the contrary. But it's something that gets overlooked way too much in what I call top-down thinking, which is philosophy, presuppositions, then the data floor, and then below that, the source methods as to what data do you pay attention to? How do you decide what's data? How do you fact check stuff to be sure that you're actually dealing with data? Do you work out what you think happened? Do you present a model? All of that's at that source methods level, and too much in dealing with creationists or flat earthers or others, you get bogged down in things that aren't connecting up to that. And in my debates so far, which you can see with Kent Hovind, or the one that Jackson Wheat and I did with Nephilim, and the ones I did with Standing for Truth, it's all aimed at source methods. And they don't like that. They don't like thinking through what they think happened. They don't like applying things to the stuff. That's why I love Q&A, because if you ask me about a thing, I'm going to answer it. I'm not going to give you boilerplate. If I don't know the answer to it, I'll say so. I'll say this isn't understood and here's why. Or I'll actually apply it and bring on new information. And worse, like when there was a question on baraminology when the debate with Kent Hovind, I knew more about baraminology than Kent does. What's wrong with this picture? And if you
and his degree is in what?
In bullshit.
Right. Okay. I
He,
mean,
yeah,
is that like
he has an imaginary PhD in science from Patriot University, and I think he's got a couple more imaginary
seems legit?
degrees in theology. If you have a chance to find his um, uh, doctoral dissertation, I should put that in quotes, that he wrote for that, it's a hoot. It's not the most incoherent creationist screed I've read, frankly. Matt Powell and Standing for Truth admitted that Matt Powell had written this tome
Oh, that
on
boy.
demolishing evolution, and that it was basically Matt's writing. And holy moly, that's not something to be proud of. Oh, what an impenetrable mess. Steve McRae gave me a link to the thing, and it's just a rambling vomit of authority quotes and segments, or coming back to the same subject over and over and again. And why didn't you organize this? Do you have like chapter titles in this? Do you have like an index? Do you have like sources listed out so we can follow them up? No, it's just a mess. And that gives you an idea of why you
Oh,
should be a creationist.
Matt Powell makes me cringe to be a millennial.
Yeah, well, we have to remember tortucanosity comes about naturally in the human species, I contend. It's not really genetic, so that you, just because you're a Tortucan doesn't mean your kids will be that way, or vice versa. Just because you are low on the Tortucanosity curve doesn't mean that you might not have a kid that way. It connects, I suspect, up to a variety of brain systems that certainly involve anterior cingulate cortex that we hominids use to resolve social conflict, and we use it for self-deception. But it mainly is the ability to just not think about stuff. And like Kurt Wise, when he kind of deflects material, you can just imagine, you get the deer in the headlight look. If you ask a mild Tortucan a question that's outside of their box, and their brain doesn't know what to deal with it, and they just can't say, gosh, I don't know about that. No, they have to have an answer, but they can't answer the question you just asked because that's outside of their box. So they go through the deer in the headlight moment. And when they answer the question, it isn't the question you asked. That's a dead giveaway you're dealing with a Tortucan. Now, somebody that's an extreme Tortucan like Donald Trump, sorry to get political, but he literally can deflect instantly. So he can be asked about a thing, and there's no deer in the headlight moment with him. He just boop, and immediately spews the dogma.
I think Donald
That
Trump is the new Godwin's Law.
Yeah, well, he's that. He's also Dunning Kruger in a red tie. I've never. He's a bundle of stuff, and as you may notice, I do occasionally veer into political issues, but that's because it's a methods issue, and it's important. Science is getting mangled at the EPA at the moment. That they haven't yet actively obliterated data, but they're not going out of their way to call attention to it. And they're scrubbing titles to make sure that things aren't necessarily available easily. They don't want to use the terminology. And this is a dead giveaway of what happens when you have Tortucans in power. They have a dogma that they want to present, and they only pay attention to things that they want to pay attention to. The problem is nature doesn't give a rat's ass. The data is still out there,
From the
and it's
chat,
scary. Yeah.
Vesta from the chat says, let's see, um, inmate pile of nonsense. The only thing he got right was, "Hi, my name is Kent Hovind." After that, it went downhill from there.
Yeah, yeah. And I made sure it went downhill with me because I was doing full blown source methods, which was to call him to account for his sources that he was doing in his videos. And he didn't have a way to prepared to respond to that. In every other debate he's done, typically he has his prepared PowerPoint and he sticks to it. And it's very difficult for a top-down person to dislodge him from that. Well, I dislodged him right off the bat. Of course, it helped the fact that he mistakenly let me go first. Puffalovica says the source methods approach is especially useful when debunking this resurgence of white nationalist propaganda that attempts to mask itself as being based on facts. Yeah, there we go, because that bumps in directly to my main area that I was trained in, which was history. and the antebellum Civil War Reconstruction period, 19th century history, all of that stuff. Not only was I interested in that just from a training angle, but historical novels that I fiddled with in my 20s all dealt with that late 19th century, early 20th century period. So I was aware of the ins and outs of what the KKK had been doing, and European racism and the rise of fascism and all that in the 1920s. And so all of this is an area that I am more than casually knowledgeable about. And when you find historical revisionists coming along who, with a straight face, Dinesh D'Souza tries this trick. With a straight face, he tries to argue that the fascists and Nazis were left-wingers. And we're going, what? And it means a complete weird renomenclature of things. He tries to assail the Democratic Party of 2019 based on the Democratic Party of 1860, which of course was secessionist and slaveholder and all of that, among others. Not just that, but as though nothing had changed. And another thing that he gets left out, just like the creationist leaves out the detail about the pillow lava factor in the volcanic rock, the defender of that position forgets that the Republican Party has changed too. I, within my lifetime, can remember when there were liberal Republicans, not less conservative, quasi on a good day moderate Republicans. I'm saying liberal Republicans, that they might just, that the range of political variety between Democrats and Republicans was a completely different landscape, where you had conservative and liberal Democrats and you had conservative and liberal Republicans. And that was an environment that was going on at least until the 1960s. So, yipes, Nelson Rockefeller, and then we go farther back when everyone's having conniption fits about socialism today. There were actual socialists who ran cities. They were in Congress and that back in 1910. Eugene V. Debs ran on the Socialist Party ticket and got a chunk of votes. That they were active. They were pushing all sorts of radical ideas like 8-hour days and 40-hour work weeks and minimum wages and unemployment insurance, and all of those terrible things, wacky, crazy ideas that eventually became mainstream politics. So I'm not quite so conniption fitty. I'm no great fan of left-wing hyper socialists, in air quotes maybe, Maduro over in Venezuela as a nutball. I'm not in favor of that. And I'm consider myself a market capitalist in that. But I don't go into conniption fit mode when the new breed of social democrats start bringing up these things. You know, it depends on what their policies are, and tell me what their policy is, and I'll say whether it's a good idea or not. And I'll defend it with evidence. But yeah, you're quite right on that, Puff, that we're in a time when sound method is not something that we're just using to talk about flat Earth or creationism or climate science or vaccination issues or nuclear policy, or, you know, it's everything. And now that we're in a tumultuous, worrisome time that reminds me way too much of the 1920s, and that didn't turn out well, that we as the people have to learn how to make better use of the data that we have, to be fair and rigorous in all cases, to not demonize but never downplay either. And that's what we need to do as citizens of America and of the world. And there's way too many places around that are turning into little Trumplandias, and our place has a threat of Trumplandia, where information up, down, alternative facts, that's violating sound methods. And civilizations fall on such basis. We can't afford to do that. Not when we can see the prize of scientific discovery and planetary exploration, all of this amazing things that we can do in the future. I don't want to have that screwed up by some nincompoop with a mindset of 1215 getting in charge and bumming up my 21st century. There we go. So we see what we got. Any questions floating around in there? Oh, Brian Stevens says that my biggest problem right now is to figure out how something can have enough matter to have gravity and not to be interactive with normal mass. We're talking about dark matter, aren't we? Yeah, that's an intriguing thing. It may involve higher dimensions. The very fact that it does gravity-ish things. For those of you who aren't aware of all this issue, galaxies, if you calculate how a galaxy should be rotating based on all the stars in it, they don't really do that. They're not turning quite as you expect them to. And it means that there's a bunch of dark matter that we can't observe, that doesn't interact in the way that matter does, the stuff that you see in stars. And yet it's there. And it looks like 90% of the universe is dark matter. But it
Hashtag dark
doesn't
matter matters.
Yeah, dark matter really matters. And dark energy is really energetic too. And that's another issue. I think when we know more about what dark matter is and dark energy, when they've gotten a new layer of the understanding to work out whether it's some new thing beyond string theory or something, I don't know. But when we know more about it, we'll probably know more of why the universe is matter and not antimatter. Why was there an abundance of one over the other? A lot of things that people are going, wow, what? How is that? We'll go, duh. In the same way that when they finally put in that plate tectonic thing that we alluded to earlier, getting back to the connect the dots stuff, we were in, suddenly things started making sense in geology and why volcanoes were the way they were and why mountain ranges looked the way they were that had been ad hoc problems in the previous geology. Oh, and before I realized that I never got to my second part, which now we're way past that. The other half of the show, which isn't going to be the other half of the show, but there's a bunch of links to it, related to a creationist, Matthew Serhati, who shot his mouth off on the reptile-mammal transition, one of my favorite topics. And he did the ear bones of mammals really evolve from the jawbones of reptiles? And I go, okay, you're weighing in on this. And if I ever do an illustrated edition of Slam Dunk, this will be in it. And I'm alluding to it in a little bit in the new Rocks book. He just jumps off the cliff. Remember, Nephi had done a bad posting that I discussed a week or two ago. And this one came along after that. And so I've been waiting, and now it pops up in this little episode. This creationist just repeats some of the same canards, like, how is it possible for parts of the jaw and the skull to get across the eardrum? It didn't. This is not how the things move. This is not how tympanic membranes are structured. This is just developmental twaddle.
Can't he just Google this stuff?
Oh, it's worse. He did Google the stuff, and the sources he gave blow his argument to smithereens. This is my... the next one he had was, second, why are there no species between reptiles and mammals which have only 2 ear bones and not 3? That was a mistake that Dwayne Gish made back in the 1970s, and Hobson back in a 1980s article that went into it. That no, that's his mistake. The bones of the articular, the quadrate, and there's a semi-articular and stuff that are linked to them. There's actually 4 little bones, but 2 main ones. They're pulled up into the inner ear as a middle ear as a unit. They're always kept together.
It's pretty sad when they're using mistakes that are older than I am.
Exactly. Yeah. So he was starting off from a bad mistake, but worse. Oh, it gets worse. Because then he decides to argue, just as Nephi did, that supposedly the genetics are different between the reptile jaw and the mammal. So he's insisting that formation of the jaw joint is regulated differently between reptiles and mammals at the gene level. In fish and amphibians, a gene called BAPX1 is responsible for the formation of the jaw joint, whereas in mammals, this gene affects the formation of tissue in the spleen, gut, and vertebral column, and not the middle ear. Well, if you follow up on the sources I linked to, which were in his article, they even described how BAPX1 is expressed in the middle ear of mammals. Exactly the opposite of what he claimed it was. Does this guy read?
My guess is no.
No. Or he is just a Tortugan looking at his little shell, scavenging around for authority quotes and squibbles. And it's a classic example of how somebody blows their own foot off. What I call doing a Garrett Hardin, which is when somebody goes out of their way. Garrett Hardin was an environmentalist in that who at one point made it just a ridiculously stupid argument on abortion issue, where he went out of his way to cite a paper that actually said exactly the opposite of what he just claimed it did. And he reprinted the whole bloody thing as an appendix. So for me, doing a Garrett Hardin is when you go out of your way to call attention to information that blows off your own foot. And this is what Serhati did on this.
Side Strike in the chat says, "Damn it, I'm late again. RJ, could you start over, please?"
Oh, let me hang myself here. Ovesta says, I watched the video review by RJ and Jackson the last few minutes of the chat with Global Idiot. I was screaming DNA is not a digital code. Yeah, we have an awful lot of fun in that. And some of the stuff that Jackson and I have encountered as a consequence of these debates or people we've interacted with on social media, we've folded in to the new book because some of them are bumping into the same idiot things. All that section on orphan genes that I'm doing in the new book came about because some creationists were waving it at me in a Twitter exchange. And I thought, oh, we didn't actually bring up orphan genes in the new book, did we? Ooh, let me remedy that. So it makes us better. Source methods makes us better and better and better. And that means now I'm in a position, and so Jackson and anybody else that follows source methods, it always improves your argument. Always. That the moment you rely on a secondary source that you don't fact check, regardless of what side you're on, you are now diminished. You are now at the mercy of your secondary source. What if the source was old? That's another problem. In the vestigial issue, organ issue, the coccyx, it turns out that quite a few of the papers that were insisting that there were no vestigial tails that had vertebrae in them, or even bones, were drawing on the same old paper from the 1980s. And they hadn't bothered to fact check more recently. This was in their own papers. Well, turns out there are, in fact, literally occasional examples of this coccygeal tail with vertebrae in them, exactly as a vestigial tail should look like. And we got the technical literature pegged down on that. So now we don't have to worry about misrepresenting something from 30 years ago. Always beware of something that's a really old source. That's another factor. That if somebody is suddenly waving something from 1970 or 1960s, like that radiometric dating thing, why are they using it so old? One possibility is that they don't want to look to see what's happened in the decades since. The other possibility, which is not mutually exclusive, is that they've relied on an old secondary source, apologetic quote mine, and they think that they don't need to worry about anything ever happening after that. Sorry.
So, just for everybody else's knowledge and, anyway, how old do you think is recent enough? When should we start?
It depends on the discipline, because some fields are really fast moving. If it's like astrophysics, if it dates from more than 5 or 10 years ago, check into it, because the technology, the new satellites that are put up, all of that is constantly advancing. Particle physics, things like that. If it's something on geology, immediately be suspicious of something that's pre-plate tectonics. So if they're waving somebody from 1965, that's antiquated as all get out, because all of that plate tectonic revolution took place in the 70s and 80s on. So you need to have much more recent material than that. In a lot of developmental biology, it's also relatively recent, because homeobox genes weren't discovered until really the 1990s, and they only started kicking in a lot of that paleogenomic investigation in the 21st century. So anything that's older than 2000 in a biological paper, check up on it.
What's a homeobox gene?
Oh, homeobox genes, HOX genes, HOX genes, there's various ways of putting them. They're these master developmental genes that came as a giant shock to biology, because if you look at a cricket and a person, you'd think, well, the developmental genes to make those are really different, right? Because a bug don't look much like us. So, we got skin and we have our bones on the inside, and everything's really different. It must be totally different systems in play. So it came as a shock when they discovered that the genes that make front, back, up, down, limbs, that all of this partitioning segmentation system, they're basically the same genes. They're HOX genes, these homeobox, because originally they were pulled from a particular thing that was a group of genes that homeodomain box is cluster, and the name got shortened to homeobox. And then it turned out that there's like a relatively small repertoire that gets copied, so that arthropods that make your bug have a different set of copies and different applications of copies, but the same core genes are involved. And then we have a different set over in the vertebrates and echinoderms and all these different critters that have completely different body plans, supposedly, still are using these same homeobox structural genes. And that's why one of the interesting issues in paleogenetics is when we're looking at these weird Ediacara things like the anomalocarids, not the Cambrian, but Dickinsonia and Claudinia, and the little weird thing that looks like a frond. I can't think of that right off the bat what that one was. Are they animals or plants? Do they use homeobox genes if they're animals? How can you make the strange forms that they are using homeobox genes? It's an interesting little issue. So hopefully that's a little bit clearer on that. And the homeobox is one of the big scientific discoveries in biology in my lifetime.
And when did this occur? You had
They
given
really started kicking in the 1990s on. And they began, and so if you Google homeobox, I'll type that into the live feed over here, homeobox, and it's a word, it's there are a bunch of modern terms in the sciences, like your dark matter, homeobox genes, Lagerstätten, plate tectonics, all of these things. You don't necessarily need to know the scientists that did them, although if you start poking around in the science papers, you'll start discovering particular names popping up over and over again, and that will mean that you become a science geek and you're becoming a groupie of the science papers. But the advantage of that, particularly in biology, is that those technical papers are almost all open access one way or the other. So you can actually explore all of that. If you're puzzled about it, you can read the Wikipedia articles on it, and it'll get you into a lot of the material, and there'll be direct links that way. And then if you want to dive in, if you have a textbook, that's another thing to deal with. I don't know the circumstance because I haven't been in school for a long time, but anybody that thinks to get into these areas based upon what they learned in high school is in big trouble, because all you're going to be getting in a high school book, say you're 50 years old and you're remembering what you learned in school 35 years earlier in your textbook, that would have been made in the 1980s with textbooks that would have been drawing upon information probably no more recent than the 1960s. They will have missed homeobox genes completely because they hadn't even been discovered yet when the textbooks were written. So if you're dealing with older farts of my age, or you might have a bit better of it in some of the more recent textbooks. And once, even so, high school textbooks often are relatively downplaying. And remember, they got to go through the Texas creationist gauntlet, where if you can't sell it in Texas, you can't sell it anywhere. So textbooks downplay a lot of the technical things, but you probably do find homeobox and others that would be mentioned in the indexing things. But then when you get to college, suddenly, kaboom, you're going to be catching up with that science that didn't get in the science textbook because some idiot in Texas didn't like the idea of mentioning evolution too much. And so it's a matter of knowing the provenance of where things are and catching up to speed on things. I've had to discover all of this stuff over things because I've been tracking down where the scientists are getting their information from, where the creationists are getting their information from. And that's when you bump into the primary source science data. So there you go. So any other bits on here? Vesta says, when quote mining, I think these people missed their calling and should have been orchard farmers, in particular, cherry orchard farmers, for all the cherry picking they do. Yeah, it is a pathology of behavior among tortucans. And creationists, I don't have to guess at the number, I measure it. Out of currently some 9,200 anti-evolution papers and works, postings and stuff, generated by about 2,200 anti-evolutionists. 95% of them don't cite primary sources at all. And of the 150 some odd that do, which is only 5%, about 2/3 of those are merely copying this from a secondary source, in the same way that Rupi and Sanford ultimately are doing an awful lot of copying for their book, and creationists are often just copying material secondarily. The core fact claimants, of which there are only about 60 in the anti-evolution movement currently, they are only paying attention to about 10% of the data field. They're missing 90% of the data. And in the case of the reptile-mammal transition, virtually 100% of it, as Mr. Serhadi was illustrating today. Follow up on that stuff. It's hilarious read. You'll discover some amazing science, and there's wonderful discussions of all this stuff. And of course, all the technical papers that they allude to in the course of their stuff are open windows that you can investigate. And just compare it with what Serhadi claimed was the case, and to see how it's worse than just tactically pointing out stuff. I mean, he was going on about he had a bunch of notes in a row for right before his conclusion on that issue of the BAPX. And yes, it's quite true that that gene functions in spleen, gut, and vertebrae. That's because it's a gene widely used in animals. It's not exclusive to the jaw. It's all over the place. But it is, in fact, used in the jaw. And given the fact that there's only two alternatives for Serhadi. Either he's dull as a sack of hammers and does not know how to read, so he did not read them discussing the BAPX use in the middle ear, or he can read and he's a liar. Those are the only two alternatives. You can be charitable and say you're an idiot, or you can be less than charitable and call him a bald-faced liar. There's no middle ground. That's source methods. It ain't for the squeamish. It's a contact sport, and in the hands of professionals, can be ruthless. No martial art fist fight could have as much incendiary power to it as a full-blown source analysis fight can be, because now you're dealing with what's going on inside the head, not what's going on in fists. And that's a mucky place for some people to be. So,
However, I must point out that if you think that fights do not involve the head, you may want to
yeah, they do bong bong bong, and also the mental space involved. That's part of the thing, is my understanding, because I'm not a martial art person, but I've bumped into people who are. That
there's a lot of strategy and physics involved. I'm just
exactly. You become a mental appreciation of the whole structure of what it is you do, so it can become instinctive. So you don't have to consciously decide what you're going to do, but you have thought through how you have done it by practice and study long before that. So that's the whole bit of why human beings can manage to do the things they do, which, since we can do amazing things, don't you think we could all learn to be good scholars?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So I think that's just about everything. I will point out that there will be no further shows this month because I'm off on a road trip with my niece to visit a family reunion, and I will not be back until August, at which point I will then go into panic mode to try to figure out how I can get the shows back going, because they're shutting down the Google Hangout technique, and I don't yet know how the hell to resolve the matter. So there may be a few missed episodes in August, but we'll work it out, and eventually I'll be back. So thank you very much. If you don't have Evolution Slam Dunk, or if you're a fiction reader and you don't have Paralogs of Phileas Fogg, get them. You can find links to that to my website. I can use the royalties, and they're good books, and I'm proud of both of them, and we'll be doing more. Jackson will have to spin. He's off on a family reunion and that as well for a while in North Carolina. So both of us are not at the moment working on the book, but we will be back working on Rocks Were There. And For those of you who already have Evolution Slam Dunk, and if you like Slam Dunk, oh, it's going to be even more fun with Rocks Were There. We are kicking butt and taking names on a gigantic scale. And it's ridiculously current in terms of its technical literature. And there's more head up their ass wrong examples that we're drawing attention to in this work than has ever been pulled together before. And it should be roughly the same size as Slam Dunk. So it's a hefty little tome that can be used as a doorstop or a brick to beat over the heads of creationists. So thank you very much for helping out, and keep spreading the word on that. And I'm plugging away as long as I can.